Well, good afternoon. This is a very interesting audience. Some of you are scholars and researchers on Darwin and evolution. Some of you are students, some of you are teachers, some of you are members of the public who just are interested in science, and may your tribe increase. And so it's hard to know where to pitch a talk with an audience this broad. Probably like me, most of you have been spending much of this year thinking about Darwin, maybe rereading some things that you haven't read in a long time, or reading some things you've been planning to read for a long time, and sort of immersing yourself in the life and history and works of this really quite amazing individual who contributes so much to modern science. Given the fact that my area of expertise, if you wish to call it that, is the creationism and evolution controversy, I got to thinking, well, what would our guy say to modern creationists? And so this is going to be not a terribly scholarly presentation as opposed to some of them in this wonderful conference of ours, but I hope you will find it entertaining, and I hope that even those of you who are scholars in this field will find some things that are new and that may be surprising to you, and others I think will probably find things that are quite surprising. Well, the very first thing that Darwin would say to modern creationists is, "What deathbed confession?" Uh-oh, hang on. There we go. Jim Moore has written this really quite wonderful brief book, The Darwin Legend, talking about this story that began back in about 1815 from one Lady Hope, who claimed that she had visited Darwin at his deathbed in 1881, and that he confessed to her that he had recanted his previous views, he had accepted Jesus as his savior, and regretted ever developing the theory of evolution, which has done so much ill in the world. Now, I want you to picture in your mind Darwin, what he looked like, and imagine him saying what he has claimed to have said. "Oh," he replied, "those theories of evolution. Oh, I put out those theories when I was a young man, searching for knowledge, and they made a religion of them. Oh, if only I could undo them." And Dr. Darwin appeared much agitated as he said these words, evidently thinking that his hypotheses had done great harm. Doesn't quite ring true to my way of mind when I think of Darwin, but nonetheless. Well, this story spread very widely, and it was quite embellished, as you can imagine, with any other urban legend. Different versions had Darwin renouncing evolution, speaking of his love of Christ. The Darwin family indignantly denied anything like this had ever happened, and denied that Lady Hope had ever even met Charles Darwin. By 1915, however, when the Lady Hope legend began to spread, Emma was dead, and the children would have been really young at the time, or not even around at the time. And so they probably would not have remembered this specific guest, who probably visited only once, if at all. Jim Moore feels that it is quite probable that Lady Hope actually did come inside Down House at one time or another. Because of some things that she reported. Elizabeth Reed Cotton was born in 1842 in Tasmania. She married Sir James Hope, who was 69 at the time, and she was only 35. They didn't have a really long marriage as a result of that. She was an evangelist, she was a pamphleteer, a promoter of temperance, and according to Jim Moore, she probably did visit Darwin sometime during the early 1880s. There was an evangelist in Down named James Fegan, who also promoted temperance and education and evangelical Christianity. And he would bring poor boys from London to the country for vacations. And on one occasion, Fegan brought his boys to Down House around Christmas time, and they sang some hymns for Darwin, and Darwin was quite charmed, and he gave them all 6 pence. And this is all written about in the correspondence. And in the fall of that year, Darwin let Fegan use the old schoolroom at Down. Moore thinks that when Fegan became ill in the summer of 1881, Lady Hope replaced him, and of course, being a member of the aristocracy, she would have been presented to Darwin, he would have accepted her, and so forth. So probably there was some sort of a social visit. Well, needless to say, there was no deathbed confession. And Interestingly enough, even Answers in Genesis, which is the largest Young Earth Creationist association or organization in the United States, or in the world really, has recommended against using the Lady Hope urban legend as a way of spreading Christian creationist apologetics. Well, the other thing that Darwin would be very surprised to hear about is the death of evolution, which, of course, he was somewhat familiar with in his day. And right from 1850, about 1860 on, there were various proponents of the idea that evolution was an idea that was on the skids, that scientists were rapidly giving up on the idea of evolution, such as J. William Dawson, the eminent geologist from McGill University, who wrote that it is true that a tide of criticism hostile to the integrity of Genesis has been rising for some years, but it seems to beat vainly against a solid rock, and the ebb has now evidently set in. The battle of historical and linguistic criticism may indeed rage for a time over the history and date of the Mosaic Law, but insofar as Genesis is concerned, it has been practically decided by scientific exploration. It is very amusing to me that Brian Alters, the author of so many very good works on evolution education, holds the William Dawson Chair at McGill University, which is fine with the Dawson family, although clearly the old man himself would probably not have been very happy. Well, that was 1894. 1935, I love this quotation, not because it is particularly profound, but because we don't write this way anymore. Good old Harry Rimmer, the chain of evidence that purports to support the theory of evolution is a chain indeed, but its links are formed of sand and mist. Analyze the evidence and it melts away. Turn the light of true investigation upon its demonstrations and they fade like fog before the freshening breeze. Sometimes I wish I could write that way, but not always. 1935. Roughly every decade, there's at least one and generally many more protestations that evolution is just about to be given up by scientists. In spite of the tremendous pressure that exists in the scientific world on the side of evolutionary propaganda, there are increasing signs of discontent and skepticism, says the great Henry Morris in 1963 and many times thereafter. Henry Morris, as you probably heard last night from Raw Numbers, I regret that I was unable to, well, for a number of reasons, I regret I was not here last night, mostly because I spent all day in airports and on the plane. I didn't get in until 2 o'clock last night in the morning, and so I missed Ron's talk, which I'm sure was wonderful, because it always is. But he probably described to you the role of Henry Morris in really creating this movement of young Earth creationism. And he was always good for a quote. Leading scientists are abandoning their faith in Darwin's theory of evolution, 1988. And in 1998, William Dembski wants to know what science is going to look like once intelligent design replaces it. We're still waiting. And another intelligent design supporter in 2005, there's no question that Darwin's theory is creaking and tottering and will implode soon. And we're all familiar, of course, with popular misunderstandings of this as well. Well, if I were going to try to educate Darwin about modern creationism, I would begin with what we at NCSE call the pillars of creationism. These are 3 categories into which it is possible, I have found it possible, my colleagues and I, to fit any creationist argument ever. It's amazing how well these 3 categories fit all of the data. But they are, first of all, what we've just heard, that evolution is a theory in crisis, that evolution is on its way out, scientists are giving up on evolution, it is a rickety theory in danger of great collapse. The second pillar is the incompatibility of religion and evolution. You have to choose. You're either a good guy Christian creationist or you're a bad guy atheist evolutionist. The third pillar is a little more complicated. This is the fairness argument. If you teach evolution, you should be fair and teach something to balance it out. Initially, as probably Ron Numbers talked about last night, initially the argument was, well, teach evolution, but teach creationism to balance it out. In the United States, that doesn't last long, given the First Amendment. Then it became teach evolution and teach an alternative science, creation science, to balance it out. That didn't last long either. Did Ron talk about any of the legal cases in his talk last night? Good. Then it was teach evolution, but balance it with intelligent design. And the current creationism du jour is teach evolution, but balance it with the teaching of the evidence against evolution, the weaknesses of evolution, the critical analysis of evolution. They're getting smarter, they're leaving the overt religiosity out of it. But the idea of fairness, interestingly enough, is the most powerful argument creationists have. Not because it's valid, but because it really resonates culturally with Americans and Canadians and most people of the Western cultural tradition. I would also point out to Darwin that modern-day creationists, much as we've heard briefly, and I'm sure Ron went into more detail, modern-day creationists follow a particular Christian theology called special creationism, in which, yes, God created, but then God creates in all versions of Christianity. In special creationist theology, it's how God creates, and it pretty much tracks a literal interpretation of Genesis. God creates everything in its present form. God creates the galaxies and the sun and the planets and plants and animals. Everything is created in its present form. When it comes to living things, plants and animals, God creates living things according to specially created kinds of organisms. God brought forth life according to kinds, and kinds do not have any common ancestry. These are separate, independent entities. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The most common kind of special creationism is the Young Earth Creationism variety, and that is where God creates all of the whole universe in a period of 6 24-hour days. But there are also a variety of old Earth creationisms, as Dr. Brooke talked about just a brief moment ago. There are many, many different versions of Christianity, views of Christianity, views of creationism, as well as there are views of evolution within the Christian tradition. And some of the old Earth creationist views are day-age creationism, gap creationism, and so forth. Now, the intelligent design proponents, I would argue, are special creationists, in the sense that they argue that there are things like the bacteria flagellum or the blood clotting cascade or other very complicated or improbable structures, elements, phenomena in biology that are incapable of being explained through natural causes. Therefore, the default is an intelligent agent created them. Well, that's special creation. In intelligent design creationism, every time you see an irreducibly complex structure, you are seeing the direct hand of God intervening. This is a highly interventionist, highly special creationist point of view, hidden underneath all of the hand-waving of information theory and molecular biology, and so forth and so on. Hurst versus Newman is a case that most people don't know very much about. This is a legal case in Southern California in the school district of El Cajon in the southern part of the state. Shortly after the judge issued the Kitzmiller versus Dover decision, we became aware that a teacher in El Cajon was offering an intercession course called Philosophy of Intelligent Design. We thought that was kind of curious because when one of our members, a geologist named Ken Hurst, some geologists in the audience, you may know Ken, he's the plaintiff in Hurst versus Newman, Ken brought this to our attention and pointed out that this really was creation science and intelligent design all kind of mushed in together. And I know that's very hard to see, and I'm not expecting you to have memorized it, but just from a distance, the X's represent creation science kinds of resources like radioisotopes in the Age of the Earth, a very famous publication from the Institute for Creation Research, Grand Canyon, Monument to Catastrophe, the Grand Canyon to Catastrophe, etc. The diamonds, and it's not an exhaustive list, I just, I was going blind trying to read this tiny little print, but the diamonds refer to intelligent design resources such as Icons of Evolution, The Privileged Planet, Unlocking the Mystery of Life, and so forth. So people in the general public tend not to distinguish as tidily between intelligent design and creation science, as I'm sure the proponents of intelligent design would like them to distinguish. And by the way, this was settled out of court. If you're interested in any of these legal cases, we have copious resources on the NCSE website, which I'll give you a reference to later on. My view is that creation science is the bigger set. Intelligent design is a subset of it. In other words, creation science will make claims like Noah's flood, producing all the sedimentary deposits of the planet, Grand Canyon being cut catastrophically, so forth and so on. They'll make a number of claims about the age of the Earth that intelligent design ignores. But that said, everything in intelligent design pre-existed in creation science. The basic design argument, even the beloved bacteria flagellum, pre-existed in creation science literature. The relationship then between the two basic kinds of creationists, creation science and intelligent design, is really quite close. Both of them attempt to find scientific justification for their views, thus going somewhat beyond the purely religious opposition to evolution that Darwin experienced. At least in terms of creation science proponents, they are in more ways similar to the scriptural geologists of the mid-1800s, who tried very hard to make science match the Bible, even including geological evidence for Noah's flood, which was independently generated again in the 20th century, as I'm sure Ron discussed, in the development of flood geology. Although modern-day creationists, even though they probably do not actually can legitimately trace much of their ancestry back to the scriptural geologists of the 1800s, they still cite them as being enlightened representatives of their point of view. Well, if you look at what Darwin talked about On the Origin of Species, he basically made 2 points. Evolution had happened, and natural selection was the main engine of its production. Common ancestry was accepted before natural selection, as we all know. It really wasn't until the 20th century and the discovery of basic genetics that the idea of natural selection found the variation that it needed. That's an old story, everybody's familiar with that. Interestingly enough, Darwin would be interested to know that modern creationists reverse this. They accept natural selection by and large, but deny common ancestry. Perhaps because there is so much evidence for natural selection, both experimental and observational, that the idea that insects can develop resistant to pesticides is kind of hard for them to argue against. They accept natural selections, they just don't think it can do anything important. So it cannot produce or affect this idea of common ancestry, this descent with modification from common ancestors. Interestingly enough, though, early creationists weren't as consistent about this. B.B. Warfield, perhaps because his family were cattle breeders, accepted natural selection but rejected the idea of common ancestry. Whereas Charles Hodge, as we just heard, and we didn't select our slides together, but as you just heard, the great Presbyterian theologian at Princeton, Charles Hodge, was much more concerned about natural selection as a replacement for design than he was with the idea of common ancestry. So it was perfectly okay for Asa Gray to be a Christian evolutionist, but according to Hodge, it was not possible to be a Christian Darwinist in the sense of the natural selection component. On the other hand, there are modern present-day creationists, such as Philip Johnson, who have problems with both. He says here in this quotation, "I will say for myself, however, it's very difficult to separate the common ancestry theory from the blind watchmaker mechanism espoused by Dawkins and other Darwinists." By the way, you've noticed, if you've read any creationist literature, especially the ID literature, that Darwinist is an epithet. No. I actually try to encourage my scientific colleagues to avoid the use of the term Darwinist because it really doesn't mean anything. In the sense that it can mean so many different things, it doesn't communicate very well. I've yet to go to a conference and see somebody walk up to someone else and say, "Hi, I understand you're a botanist. I'm a Darwinist." That's just not the way we refer to each other. Generally one would refer to oneself as an evolutionary biologist, not as a Darwinist. When you're talking about the ideas of Darwin in the 19th century, 1800s, it might be perhaps more appropriate. But it's interesting, and there's another whole talk we can do on that, about how the word Darwinism has become an epithet among modern anti-evolutionists. And part of it is this association, as you can see reflected in the quote from Johnson here, of evolution by natural selection being associated with atheism. The blind watchmaker hypothesis here is what he's referring to here. And of course that old dichotomy between the good guys on one side and the bad guys on the other side. But it is the idea of common ancestry, indeed, that modern-day creationists of either the creation science or intelligent design persuasion are really opposing. At the top of this diagram is what is referred to by them as the creationist lawn. This is an illustration, by the way, from Kurt Wise, a Young Earth Creationist, in one of the proceedings of the International Creationist Conference's books from the 1990s. The creationist lawn, of course, is the separate creation of all the lineages, as contrasted, of course, with the evolutionist tree, which is common ancestry. The new neo-creationism proposed by Kurt Wise and others is the orchard, where you have separate creation as in the lawn, but then you have evolution within the kind. This actually solves a lot of creationist problems about flood geology and how the number of kinds that Noah had to take on the ark. And so the idea of the creationist orchard is a very useful one for the neo-creationists who are trying to work all of these items in. Now, as I say, this is an illustration by Kurt Wise, a Young Earth Creationist, very well known as a Young Earth Creationist. The same idea comes up in the most recent intelligent design publication, Explore Evolution, in which they talk about the orchard view, branching within major groups but no connections between them. The connections between creation science and intelligent design are very deep and very clear if you only look for them. They make many, many efforts to try to separate themselves from the creationist ancestors, if you will. But truly, intelligent design is merely a subset of creation science. Well, one thing that Darwin would be extremely surprised to learn about is the resurgence in modern creationism of some very, very old ideas, such as geocentrism. Gerardus Buo is the president of the Biblical Astronomy Association, formerly called the Tychonian Society, and he is a modern 20th and 21st century geocentrist. He follows the Tychonian view. If you take a look at that, you can see the little yellow dot in the middle, that's the sun, and you notice the blue dot, that's the Earth. Well, notice that all of the planets go around the sun, but the sun goes around the Earth. So you kind of handle a lot of the astronomical ahas from the audience there. See? Now these people are thinking, right? So now, geocentrism is a minority movement even within creation science. I mean, this is not considered to be a very broadly based or widely accepted view in the general public or even in the anti-evolution community, but it is there. And of course, the reasons for geocentrism are the same as the reasons for rejecting common ancestry, and that is because it disagrees with the literal interpretation of the Bible. As Buo says, if God cannot be taken literally when he writes of the rising of the sun, how can one insist that he be taken literally when writing of the rising of the sun? Now, I'm sure that I would be argued with by some of the creation science proponents, but I would argue that Russell Humphrey's Starlight and Time book is really kind of a neo-geo, if you will, a neo-geocreationism that is emerging very quietly in the corners in the creation science movement. Humphreys wrote his book Starlight and Time to solve the problem of the size of the universe corresponding with the age of the universe. Remember, Young Earth Creationists believe that the universe is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. This is a problem with light years, because if the universe is young, how can light still just be reaching us from galaxies billions of light years away? Now, one solution to this problem a number of years ago was to argue that the speed of light is actually slowing down. And even for creationist physicists, that was a bit much. So that has largely been done away with. Sutterfield's argument about the speed of light changing over time has been pretty much abandoned by creationists. But how can light have been traveling billions of years if Earth is only thousands of years old? Well, Humphrey solves this by having an ancient universe but a recent Earth. There's a gravitational well around Earth that slows down time. He's worked relativity into creation science now. While time is still billions of years outside of the local area, the Earth is still only 6,000 years old. He has an interesting picture of the universe, which is spherical and is covered with a thin layer of water. You can see in this cutaway all the galaxies of the universe are inside this sphere of water, and the Earth is right smack in the middle, hence what I would call neo-geocentrism. And of course, if you remember your Bible and the story of the flood, the 40 days and 40 nights of rain came from the water above the firmament. Well, the firmament is viewed, there's ahas going on all over here. This is, you know, this stuff is so much fun when you get in. The firmament is envisioned as this sort of dome or support all the way around, in this case, the whole universe. It used to be just over the planet Earth. On the other hand, if the flood waters came from the water above the firmament, it's coming from really, really far away. So, you know, I don't think Humphreys has quite got all of his ducks in a row here. So, Darwin would certainly be surprised at all of the new ways that creationists have found to object to some of his ideas. He would not have been surprised, though he probably would have been disappointed, to see himself demonized. He certainly was familiar with caricatures of him and presentations of him, mocking him in various and sundry ways. The demonization of Darwin is actually a very serious issue today. It wasn't new. Certainly at the turn of the century, the association of evolution and natural selection associated with negative social conditions and movements is said by historians to have stimulated the first round of anti-evolution activity in the second decade of the 20th century. Many socially progressive thinkers associated evolution, especially, of course, evolution by natural selection, the Darwinist mechanism, with social Darwinism, sweatshops, child labor, exploitation of the workers. These were justified by laissez-faire capitalists such as Carnegie as being natural. And William Jennings Bryan, who was a great progressive, and I tell you, everybody in Berkeley would vote for him today if he were alive today, railed against the exploitation of workers in the name of science. And he was justified in doing so back at the turn of the century. Similarly, the excesses of Germany in World War I were claimed to spring from German rationalist enthusiasms for evolution. Vernon Kellogg's Headquarters Nights, although it was a fantasy, nonetheless inspired a backlash against evolution from members of the intelligentsia, which spread to the general public. And of course, with World War II, similar claims were made for Hitler and the Nazis being inspired by Darwin. The truth, of course, is far more nuanced, as scholars of the subject, such as Robert Richards, have pointed out. The most recent example of demonizing Darwin was the 2008 documentary Expelled, starring actor Ben Stein. Just for fun, how many of you saw that? Oh, I'm so glad. No, this is part of your education. You really should see this movie. The good news is that you can see it for free on Netflix now, so there you have it. The thrust of the movie is that Darwinian materialism is preventing any dissenting view from atheistic evolution and atheistic science from being expressed. In particular, intelligent design proponents are being prevented from getting their views heard. They are suffering employment discrimination, their ideas are generally being dismissed without even being given a hearing, and generally receiving very shabby treatment. Such martyrs as Guillermo Gonzalez, who was not given tenure at the University of Iowa. Richard von Sternberg, who had problems with an intelligent design article that he published in the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, which was considered inappropriate for that journal. Carolyn Crocker claims employment discrimination regarding jobs she held at a variety of universities and community colleges in the DC area, and a number of other martyrs, which supposedly, merely for their objection to classical evolution and Darwinism, using the epithet sense, have suffered grievously, so is the claim, for their views. If you're interested, you can go to expelledexposed.com, which is NCSE's website that we set up to deal with this, and the martyrs, rather long biographies of the actual, what we believe are more accurate interpretations of what they experienced. It more than, considerably less than meets the eye. The other major theme of Expelled is the link between evolution, atheism, eugenics, and Nazis, which clearly is a simplification. Let me blow up that highlighted area. Evolution leads to atheism, leads to eugenics, leads to Holocaust in Nazi Germany. That's from the website. Now clearly, ideologues are going to seize upon any powerful idea to push their agenda. Science is full of powerful ideas, including evolution by natural selection. Religion is also full of powerful ideas, and there are far more references to God and the Bible in Mein Kampf than there is to Darwin. Again, if you want to go to expelledexposed.com, we've got a section on Hitler and eugenics with some references that you can consult. But it is sort of interesting to look at this movie. You probably are unaware that the Darwinian establishment is controlling big science. That my colleagues and I, you probably didn't know that I had the National Academy of Sciences by my little Mariette strings here. They are dancing to my tune. At least they used pictures of us that were about 15 years old, so we all look fabulous, so, you know. When they were seeking people to interview for this movie, they dissembled to all of us in the movie as to what their actual purposes in making this movie were. But one might conclude from having seen this movie, it was not exactly a dispassionate documentary. People interviewed include Richard Dawkins, Michael Shermer, Will Provine, me, P.Z. Myers. Now, what do all of these people have in common? Well, none of us believe in God. We also have a lot of things that are not in common, and not just the chromosomal count either. I mean, to assume that all of us agree in every respect is quite silly. But I know that it was very interesting that somebody like Ken Miller, who is a far more important critic of intelligent design than Will Provine is, he was somehow never even consulted for an interview. And Rob Pennock, who's written extraordinarily insightful philosophy of science articles and books, done excellent work critiquing intelligent design. He was interviewed, but once he started talking with them, they left him out as well. And a man named Dennis Lamoureux, who's been a very strong critic of intelligent design and creationism in general, he didn't even get a call. Now, what do all these three people have in common? Well, they are all competent scholars in the field of intelligent design, but they are all theists. Clearly, if you were truly producing a dispassionate documentary, you might include some people whose point of views are a little different, but that would have interfered greatly with the presentation of the evolution side, the big science side as all atheists, as opposed to the good guys. Another recent book is The Darwin Myth, The Life and Lies of Charles Darwin by Benjamin Weicker. Another case where Darwin is associated with the evils of Nazis, eugenics, and other social Darwinists concerned. I love the subtitle of this book. There's a forthcoming review of Weicker's book in NCSE Reports, in which the book is compared, not favorably, to Rita Skeeter's Life and Lies of Albus Dumbledore, and containing comparable accuracies, and you will just wait for it to come out. Darwin would have been very surprised about the rise of Islamic anti-evolutionism. The migration of large numbers of Muslims from the Middle East and elsewhere was unknown in Darwin's time. Writings of the Turkish creationist Adnan Akhtar, writing as Harun Yahya, are widespread in the Muslim community, and in Great Britain there is much opposition to evolution in the Muslim community, even at the university level. And Darwin would be very surprised at Hindu creationism. The Krishna consciousness movement, sponsored by the Bhaktivedanta Institute in the United States, in the 1990s produced this video, The Mysterious Origins of Man, a documentary that was shown on network TV, NBC actually, presenting the view that there were serious problems with evolution, with proof from the Bhaktivedanta Institute publications like Forbidden Archaeology, taking the old earth Hindu point of view, but still being special creationist. Well, of course, what Darwin truly would be excited about is the growth of real science that refutes the creationist ideas and supports his. As a geologist, he would be very excited about continental drift, which solves so many fossil biogeographic puzzles. He would be very excited about Mendelian genetics, providing the source for recurring variation, and obviously to Watson and Crick and the discovery of the molecular basis of heredity. From the beginnings of the understanding of developmental biology, today's Evo Devo, he would just be thrilled about all of these things. And of course, the fossil record has improved in so many ways. Indohyus showing the sort of small modifications toward a marine mammal that Darwin said would be found, and of course the dozens of others of the whale evolutionary sequence, which we are now familiar with. And even biogeography has continued to be a vigorous area of research, even coming to the public in excellent books like David Quammen's Song of the Dodo. And yet all of these well-supported principles and observations are questioned in the most recent intelligent design effort to bring confusion to schools, Explore Evolution. So we're finally left to ask the question, what would Darwin say about today's creationists? I suspect he'd probably give them his sternest gaze and ask, whatever were you thinking? If you want more information on this, go to ncse.com. You can sign up for a weekly electronic newsletter that will be very depressing, but informative. The news page, you can sort for your state or what year and find all sorts of information, and obviously we'd be delighted if you joined. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I hope I had something for everybody in there, that there was at least one thing that surprised you in this little review.
Thanks, Eugenie, for an excellent presentation. I just want to underscore what you said about the use of the term Darwinism and Darwinist. I think it's a clear intent to personalize this great scientific explanation of nature by attributing it to one person. And we should absolutely avoid that at all costs. It's kind of like Marxism, Leninism, Darwinism, you know, bad ideas by individual people. So I just wanted to comment that that's an important point. Two other points I think are worth emphasizing. We need to explain the use of the word theory in science as something that's supported by overwhelming evidence and that has been tested and retested. We all know this. But apparently, a lot of scientists don't, and it's not taught. We also need to teach the difference between induction and deduction. That science isn't about proof, it's about probabilities. So these are all important, fundamental and simple aspects of the way we teach about natural selection and evolution, but we very often ignore these important points.
Thank you for your comments. While the microphone is being passed, I'll also mention that, remember that Darwinism is an ism. Isms are ideologies. What do we want to be? We don't want to be teaching children ideologies in our schools, right? That's part of the packaging of Darwinism. I mean, you know, you're a geologist. You don't refer to yourself as a lyalist, okay? So there's no reason for evolutionary biologists to refer to ourselves by our 19th century ancestor.
I have what might be kind of a naive question, but I think neither you nor Professor Numbers mentioned this. I take it part of being a creationist, or new creationist, neo, is to be able to say that you interpret Genesis literally, right?
Yes and no.
Well, at least that's part of it. You want it to be that God created man separately from the animals.
Special creation is part of it. It doesn't have to be the literal interpretation of Genesis. Remember, the intelligent design people are old agers.
Right, there's the two different brands. But I think, so let me just ask my question, and it will be naive or not. Am I remembering my early training in thinking that there are two different stories in Genesis?
At least.
There's the one where God creates everything else first and man at the end, Adam, and then there's the one where Adam's lonely, and so then he gets the animals. And
yeah,
is that kind of right? And does this not bother the creationists?
It doesn't bother the creationists. If you ask
how
the
could
folks,
it not?
You just obviously do not understand the flexibility with which sacred text can be interpreted. And that includes the origin of species, all right? I would answer you, Henry Morris at the Institute for Creation Research would say that the two stories in Genesis are telling the same story. One just goes into more detail. And yes, I know there are, that's just the answer. So it doesn't bother them. Don't ask for too much consistency.
Would you like to say something about the creationist plans to reissue The Origin of Species on the 24th of November at 20 prominent campuses?
Yes. How many of you know who Ray Comfort is? The Banana Man. Yes. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, please go to YouTube and Google Ray Comfort Banana. And it's really worthwhile. Ray Comfort is an evangelical minister. He has taken as his ministry anti-evolution. And he has decided that he's going to distribute over 100,000 copies of On the Origin of Species on the 20th of November at 50 campuses around the country. But this is going to be an annotated, or I should not say an annotated, this is going to be a modified version of The Origin. He has added a 52-page introduction, which cribs, the first 8 or so pages is cribbed from a British Council biography of Darwin, and the last several pages, last 8 pages or so, is just very heavy-handed apologetics that isn't going to appeal to everybody anyway. And the middle section is just scientific rubbish. It's just classic creation science, gaps in the fossil record, and the usual stuff. And so what do we do about this? NCSC has decided that it would be smartest, our position is that it would be smartest not to make a huge big deal out of this, because the only reason they're doing this is to get publicity for their ideas, and their whole framework, their whole frame of this kind of experience is big science is not letting you college students hear the truth. So our position is, students, run, don't walk, line up, get your free copy of On the Origin of Species. This is a book that you should have in your library. You should have it on your own shelves. Get your free copy now. And we are going to be distributing a very useful bookmark on our website, and to the people we work with at the various campuses, they'll be handing out these bookmarks. On the one, the bookmark, of course, is in the shape of a banana. And on one side, the bookmark says bananas, and the other side, it's good science, and you can put it in on page 52. Which I think is probably a better approach than getting too heavy-handed about it. But we also have solicited comments from a number of scholars, some of whom are in this room, because we will also have a one-page handout for why this is, why this is bananas, why this is bad science. So students who are interested in this can find out for themselves. There's also actually today on U.S. News and World Report, the guy who writes the evolution, or the religion column, has just published a little op-ed from Ray Comfort. My response to this will be tomorrow, and then Comfort has response too, and I get the last word, right? That was on purpose. And so that's another way of sort of countering this sort of thing. But yeah, it's probably not a really good idea to go after this hammer and tongs with our heaviest artillery. He may be blowing smoke anyway about how many copies of this he's going to publish. But on the other hand, it's a free copy of Origin. You can skip the first part. Thank you so much.
Thank you.